The letter was never meant to be found. According to the archives of a small diocesan office in northern Italy, the document appeared among routine parish correspondence sometime in late October of 1978. At first glance, it looked ordinary. A single page. Typed. Dated. Signed by a priest whose handwriting had been verified many times before. But the content of the letter was anything but ordinary. It began with a single sentence. I believe I have encountered something that does not belong in the world of the living. The priest who wrote those words was Father Matteo Bellini. For nearly 20 years, Father Bellini had served quietly in the rural parish of San Girolamo, a weathered stone church that sat at the edge of a farming village surrounded by vineyards and mist-covered hills. Church records describe him as disciplined, reserved, and deeply methodical in his work. Parishioners remembered him as a calm presence, never dramatic, never prone to superstition. He was not a man who frightened easily, which is precisely why the letter disturbed those who later read it, because the priest who wrote it vanished only 3 days after it was sent, and the last lines of the letter suggested that whatever he had encountered was still inside the church. Witnesses later reported that the trouble seemed to begin during the final weeks of September, when Father Bellini requested access to the locked storage rooms beneath the old rectory. These rooms had not been opened in decades. According to parish records dating back to the early 1900s, the underground chambers had originally been used to store ceremonial objects, old manuscripts, and damaged religious artifacts that were no longer suitable for use during services. Over time, the rooms had simply been sealed. The keys were kept in the rectory office, hanging from a small wooden rack alongside several others. For years, no one had touched them, until Father Bellini removed them one evening after Vespers. The housekeeper who lived next door to the rectory later told investigators that she noticed the lights burning unusually late that night. Around midnight, she saw Father Bellini carrying a lantern down the stone steps that led to the cellar entrance. She assumed he was cataloging old items. He often worked late, but the following morning, something about his behavior had changed. He appeared tired, pale, distracted. When the housekeeper asked if he had slept, he reportedly paused for several seconds before answering. Then he said something unusual. He said he had heard movement beneath the church. At first she believed he meant rats. The cellar had always been cold and damp, and it was not uncommon for small animals to slip through cracks in the foundation. But Father Bellini shook his head. According to her testimony, he said the movement sounded deliberate, slow, measured, as if someone were walking through the rooms below. The housekeeper reminded him that no one had entered those chambers in decades. But Father Bellini simply looked toward the floor and replied quietly, "That is what concerns me." Over the following days, several villagers began to notice subtle changes in the priest's routine. He continued to hold Mass at the usual hours. His sermons remained composed and thoughtful, but outside the church, he seemed increasingly preoccupied. A local groundskeeper later recalled seeing Father Bellini standing in the courtyard late at night, staring toward the cellar entrance. Not moving, just listening. On the evening of October 3rd, Father Bellini returned to the underground rooms for the second time. This time, he carried more than a lantern. Witnesses reported seeing him take a small wooden crucifix, a vial of holy water, and a leather-bound notebook before descending the stairs. The cellar door closed behind him shortly after 9 o'clock. No one knows exactly what happened in the hours that followed, but the notebook he carried was eventually recovered. Inside its pages were several entries written in Father Bellini's careful handwriting. The first entry appeared to describe the condition of the cellar. The air is colder than expected, not the natural cold of stone. Something heavier, as if the room resists warmth. The next entry was written several lines below. I hear movement again. It begins after the lantern dims. According to the time marks in the notebook, Father Bellini remained below the church for nearly 3 hours. And during that time, his notes began to change. The writing became tighter, more hurried. One passage reads, "There is no visible source for the sound, yet it continues. Not footsteps. Something dragging. Something patient." Another line, written near the bottom of the page, appears darker, as if the pen had pressed harder against the paper. It knows when I am standing still. When Father Bellini finally returned to the rectory that night, the housekeeper said he looked deeply shaken. He did not explain what he had found. He simply locked the cellar door and placed the keys back on the rack. Then he went to his study and remained there until morning. The next day, he began writing the letter. Church archivists later confirmed that the document was addressed to the diocesan office in Bologna. The letter was formal in tone, but its contents suggested that Father Bellini was struggling to describe something he could barely understand. He wrote that the disturbances in the cellar could not be explained by structural movement or animals. He stated that the sounds responded to his presence, and he claimed that the temperature in the underground chambers dropped suddenly whenever he attempted to pray. But the most troubling passage appeared near the middle of the page. I believe there is an influence attached to an object stored beneath the church. I cannot yet determine which one, but it reacts to the presence of Scripture. The letter continued. I attempted to bless the room, but the lantern extinguished itself each time I began the prayer. At that point in the document, Father Bellini's typing grew uneven. Several words had been struck through and retyped. One sentence appeared only partially finished. It is not the room that concerns me. It is the possibility that the object has been waiting. The sentence ended there. Below it, he typed another line. I request guidance and authorization to examine the artifacts stored beneath the rectory in greater detail. But before signing the letter, Father Bellini added one final paragraph. The archivists who later read the document noted that this section had been typed separately, as if the priest had returned to the page after some time. The paragraph read, There is something else I must report. During my second visit to the cellar, I experienced a moment in which I believed someone was standing directly behind me. When I turned, the room was empty, yet the sound of breathing continued for several seconds. The letter ended with a final sentence. I do not believe the disturbance wishes to remain hidden. The document was dated October 4th. It arrived at the diocesan office 2 days later. But by the time church officials attempted to contact Father Bellini for clarification, he had already disappeared. According to village records, the last confirmed sighting of Father Bellini occurred on the evening of October 6th. A farmer walking past the church shortly after sunset reported seeing light inside the cellar stairwell. The cellar door was slightly open, and Father Bellini was standing at the top of the steps, holding his lantern. The farmer greeted him, but the priest did not respond. He simply stared down into the darkness below. After a moment, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. That was the last time anyone in the village saw Father Matteo Bellini alive. The following morning, the housekeeper noticed something unusual. The cellar keys were missing from the rack again. At first, she assumed the priest had gone down to inspect the rooms once more. But when he failed to appear for morning mass, concern began to spread quickly through the village. By midday, several parishioners had entered the church to search for him. They found the main sanctuary empty. His study was undisturbed. His coat still hung by the door. But when they reached the cellar entrance, they noticed something that immediately unsettled them. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, and from the darkness below came the faint, steady sound of something moving slowly across the stone floor. The men who stood at the cellar entrance later said the sound was subtle at first. Not loud, not violent, just a slow, scraping movement somewhere below the church. One of the parishioners called out Father Bellini's name. His voice echoed down the stone stairwell and disappeared into the dark. There was no answer, but the scraping sound stopped immediately. For several seconds, the silence was complete. Then the movement began again. This time it seemed closer. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. 3 of them decided to go down. The stairs were narrow and uneven, worn smooth by time. The air grew noticeably colder with every step. By the time they reached the bottom, the smell of damp stone filled the narrow corridor. The cellar beneath San Girolamo had been built long before electricity reached the village. Lantern hooks still hung from the walls, though most had rusted beyond use. The men carried only a small flashlight and a candle. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a corridor lined with wooden doors that led to separate storage rooms. Everything appeared still, but the air felt wrong. One of the men later described the sensation as pressure, like the quiet tension before a thunderstorm. They called Father Bellini's name again. Nothing answered. At the far end of the corridor, they noticed light flickering faintly beneath one of the doors. It was the room Father Bellini had opened days earlier. As they approached, the scraping sound returned. It was coming from inside. The men hesitated. Then one of them pushed the door open. The room beyond was larger than expected. Stone shelves lined the walls, holding dozens of objects wrapped in cloth, wooden crates, and stacks of yellowed manuscripts tied with string. Father Bellini's lantern sat on the floor near the center of the room. It was still burning, but the priest himself was nowhere in sight. The villagers searched the room carefully. They called his name again and again. There was no reply. Yet several of them later insisted that they felt something moving in the shadows behind the shelves. Not seen, only sensed. One of the men noticed something strange on the stone floor beside the lantern. Father Bellini's notebook lay open. Its pages fluttered slightly in the cold air. The last entry had been written hurriedly. The handwriting was uneven, as if the priest's hand had been shaking. It read, "The object is reacting again." I moved it from the shelf, and the sound began immediately. Below that line, another sentence had been written more quickly. "I believe it has been disturbed before." The final line of the entry was written so heavily that the pen had nearly torn the paper. "It does not want to be moved." The villagers searched the shelves surrounding the lantern. Most of the objects appeared untouched, but one item had clearly been removed from its place. A rectangular space in the dust marked where something had once rested. The cloth covering that section of the shelf had been pushed aside, but whatever had been there was gone. The men searched the entire room. They looked behind crates, inside storage chests, even along the walls in case Father Bellini had fallen or become injured. There was no trace of him. The only unusual detail was the lantern itself. According to those present, the flame inside the lantern flickered violently whenever they approached the empty space on the shelf. One of the men attempted to lift it. The moment he touched the handle, the flame went out completely. The room plunged into darkness. Several seconds passed before someone managed to relight the candle. When the light returned, something else had changed. The door behind them had closed. None of the men remembered touching it. One of them moved quickly to open it again, but the door resisted for a moment before finally swinging outward. The corridor beyond was silent, and colder than before. The villagers left the cellar immediately. By evening, the local authorities had been notified. 2 officers arrived from a neighboring town to conduct a search of the church and surrounding property. They questioned the villagers. They inspected the cellar, and they reviewed the contents of Father Bellini's notebook. But nothing they found explained his disappearance. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints beyond those of the villagers themselves, and no sign of the missing object that had apparently been removed from the shelf. The officers initially suspected that Father Bellini might have left the village voluntarily. But this theory quickly began to fall apart. His personal belongings remained untouched in the rectory. His passport had not been used, and the villagers insisted that he had shown no sign of planning a departure. Meanwhile, word of the letter had reached the diocesan office. 2 representatives from the church arrived in San Girolamo several days later to review the situation. Among them was an elderly priest named Father Lorenzo Carli, who had spent many years studying unusual cases involving reported spiritual disturbances. He requested immediate access to the cellar. The villagers were reluctant to return, but Father Carli insisted. When he descended the stairwell, he carried a lantern, a small metal case, and the letter that Father Bellini had written days earlier. The cellar felt even colder than before. As Father Carli moved through the corridor, he noticed something unusual. The air seemed to grow colder the closer he approached the storage room. When he finally entered, the lantern flame flickered violently. He examined the shelves carefully. Most of the artifacts stored there were harmless objects, damaged crucifixes, old prayer books, fragments of broken statues. But when he reached the empty space on the shelf described in the notebook, he stopped. The dust surrounding the space had been disturbed again. Something had been placed there briefly, then removed. Father Carley studied the shelf for several minutes. Then he turned to the villagers standing behind him and asked a simple question. "Has anyone entered this room since the search?" They all shook their heads. He nodded slowly. Then he opened the metal case he had brought with him. Inside were several small instruments used by the church to examine old artifacts. He began testing the surrounding objects one by one. Most showed nothing unusual. But when he reached the section of shelf beside the empty space, he paused. There, partially hidden behind a stack of old documents, he found something the villagers had overlooked. It was a thin wooden board, no larger than a book. The surface was dark with age, and carved into its center was a series of symbols arranged in a circular pattern. Father Carley lifted the board carefully. The moment it left the shelf, the lantern flame dimmed. The temperature in the room dropped so sharply that several of the villagers could see their breath in the air. One of them whispered that the sound had returned. At first Father Carley did not hear it, but then the scraping began again. Slow, deliberate, moving somewhere within the walls of the cellar. Father Carley stared down at the wooden board. Then he turned it over. On the back was a line of writing burned into the surface. The letters were old, crude, but still legible. After reading the inscription, Father Carley reportedly went completely silent. One of the villagers asked what the words meant. The old priest did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed the board carefully back onto the shelf. The scraping sound stopped. Then he finally spoke, and what he said unsettled everyone in the room. He told them the writing was not a prayer. It was a warning. And according to the translation, the message read, "Do not wake what listens beneath the altar." But Father Carley had noticed something else. Something even more disturbing. The symbols carved into the front of the board were incomplete. A portion of the circle had been broken, as if something once attached to the board had been removed. And that missing piece, he believed, was exactly what Father Bellini had taken with him the night he disappeared. Because according to the priest's notebook, the object he had moved from the shelf had been small, portable, and capable of being carried easily in one hand, which meant that somewhere in the church or somewhere beneath it, the missing piece of that carved board was still present. And if Father Carley's translation of the warning was correct, then whatever had been sealed by that symbol had just been disturbed. The old priest stood in the cold silence of the cellar for several moments, listening. Then he quietly asked the villagers a question that none of them were prepared to answer. Had anyone checked beneath the altar of the church since Father Bellini vanished? Because if the warning carved into the board was meant to be taken literally, then the place where the priest had disappeared might not have been the cellar at all.